Good afternoon, my name is Oleg Pokalchuk and I'm happy to see all of you here in Ukrainian Media Center Ukrinform. It's been 9 years of the war and today is day 407 of the full-scale invasion of our homeland by a Russian aggressor, and today we have invited you to talk about the very important topic: how Russia uses the education against our children and what should we do about it. I want to introduce our speakers today. It's Valentina Potapova, head of Almenda Center for Civil Education, and Daryna Pidgorna, a lawyer with the Regional Center for Human Rights, and Oleg Pokalchuk, social psychologist, who is joining us online, and Anna Babinets, who just joined us, head of the independent investigative journalist agency Sledstvo.Info. Dear friends, we understand that now we're in a situation when 1 million of our kids are currently in the temporarily occupied territory or are deported. We see all types of violations and war crimes committed against our children by the occupier state. So let's talk about the goals of the occupiers. What do they want by implementing their education programs and switching our children to those education programs? We understand that the main goal is the eradication of our identity, but you as specialists, as experts, may help us look from some other vantage point at that. Yeah, does anybody hear me? Well, really, there was a very powerful political resonance after International Criminal Court issued the arrest warrant in the name of Putin, the head of the state, and Lvova Belova, who were accused of assistance to the deportation, physical deportation of the children from Ukraine to Russian Federation. However, you know what's behind the scene is the children whom we call invisible children, those who remained in the occupied territories, and those children, it's not 19,000 of them. This is the number that is being named in the media. That's the number of children moved to the Russian Federation, but they ended up under the control of Russian government in the occupied territories. So we're talking here about more than 1 million children. Why is this my estimate? Because we also counted children who remained in the Crimea. It's 458,000 of them there, and they're under the influence of Russian propaganda, under the influence of those tools being used to them to move them from one group to another. So those children, they were Ukrainian children, they were studying history of Ukraine, they had some cultural Ukrainian identity, they were considering themselves citizens of Ukraine, and that was the environment they were growing up in. But then the occupation has begun, and during that occupation, very quickly everything Ukrainian was destroyed in the system of education. the horror of this situation is that those children, they cannot disappear, they cannot go anywhere. If an adult may switch off the TV, they may go out of the internet bubble where Russian bloggers try to promote some opinion or some agenda. The children who end up in their schools, they cannot go out of those schools. And when Crimea scenarios started being applied in Kherson and Zaporizhia regions, the first thing they've done was integration of the education system of Kherson and Zaporizhia regions into the education system of Russian Federation. They did not integrate the court system, for example, the judicial system. There was no relevant legislation adopted. They did not integrate medical system with the legislation, but there was specific legislation for integration of education system, because again, what they mentioned, the goal of their special military operation was denazification, and they start implementing it through education. And those parents who don't want their children to visit, to attend Russian schools, they were pressed on. For example, in Berdansk there were 5 penalties for the parents who did not want their children to attend Russian schools, and they continued educating their children remotely under Ukrainian standards. So we see that the children who remained there, they were the victims of that consistent policy exercised by the Russian Federation in order to educate more than 1 million children and youth in the spirit of a great state of Russia. And there were funds allocated, a lot of funds allocated from federal budget for this goal. And it's informal education, youth movements, the Young Eagles movement, the First Ones movement. I'm not even talking about the infamous Unarnia. It's the roller going over our children. And unfortunately, when we consider it from the international law vantage point, is the violation that is considered not so serious. It is a violation, but it's not as serious as physical deportation of children. And this is why they feel this impunity, and the consequence of this impunity is that they continue to spread that system. And if nothing changes in perception of this war crime, it will keep on spreading on and on and on. And moreover, this impunity will stimulate other countries which are engaged in military conflicts to use that scenario. This is what we've seen on the example of Taliban, and now we see it in Europe with Russian Federation doing this to our children. Daryna, let's talk about the international classification. How do our international partners and our human rights organizations evaluate this situation? We see that the Russian education program is not only working to eradicate our identity, but to politicize our Ukrainian children. What Ms. Valentina just mentioned about this Unarnia in Mariupol, they start this work right away. They get our children engaged in those militarized processes. So what's the assessment of those events by international organizations, international community, and how do we estimate it? Thank you. Thank you. I have to say that Ms. Valentina, she's handling this, dealing with this issue for a long time, specifically with the children who end up in the occupied territories, I mean their education, but within those 9 years of the war. Unfortunately, only now we have started talking about the education. Only now that it's the time that the eyes of the international community are opening, and everybody is seeing what Russia is doing to the children who end up in the occupied territories and those who were deported to Russian Federation. Obviously, Ms. Valentina mentioned Taliban, how they educate their kids from the point of view of international law, international policy. The crimes of Taliban are more obvious because children were engaged directly, not in education, but in propaganda of war, participation of war. They were physically trained to certain armed conflicts. Russia acts in a different way. They act gradually, they act comparatively softly, but consistently. And now we see it quite in quite vibrant colors. What Russia puts in the standard from point of view of law, from the legal point of view, we studied 130 study books which Russia offers for studying to the children from the occupied territories, for those internally displaced or who were forced to leave the Russian Federation or were forcibly deported. And we may state that there are three indicators that we clearly understand. First of all, Russia calls to create the so-called all-Russian identity that has absorbing effect, meaning that other cultural identities in Russian Federation, they don't have any right to exist, no right to develop, no right except for demonstration of certain Sharovari stereotypic comic features, but you cannot develop your identity in any other way, in something that gives development to the nation, to the national identity. And this all-Russian identity for all the people in the Russian Federation makes all of them to be Russian patriots. They have to lay their lives, their health, their values, everything for the state. Not only for the state as it is, but as a political machine. Everything that you do should be in favor of Putin, in favor of the government that rules your country. There is a number of examples in those study books for the children. It's printed in bold letters how children were expressing their patriotic feelings during other conflicts, during, for example, World War II or the battle at Suzdal Lake, when children were laying their lives to destroy a tank, to damage an enemy convoy. And that was described as deeds in favor of the state, in favor of the government. And on this background, it flows, this identity, patriotism flows into militarization, when they write in their study books that the key enemy of Russia is NATO, is somebody against whom we should stand with the nuclear arms, with the small arms in your hands. So they said that the army is the best time of your life. So children of the 8th grade age, they are told that war is the best way to express your patriotic feelings, the best way to express your identity that was created within those years that we teach you. As a lawyer, I see a number of violations from the point of view of the international law. In this, talking generally, a country that occupied the territory has to leave the order of things that were in place in this occupied territory before occupation. I mean, the education, law, order, security situation should be remained in the same condition according to the laws of the country which controlled that territory before. The education should have continued to develop under Ukrainian standards, traditions, Ukrainian study books. Unfortunately, Russia is ignoring all the laws and regulations of this law. They keep imposing Russian policy over those processes, not only stimulating children to lose their Ukrainian identity, but even to counter any thoughts that Ukraine may exist, that this identity may exist, because this is how it's written in those study books, that Ukraine does not exist. Ukrainians do not exist as a separate nation. There are only Russians. So we see both war crimes and assistance in engagement in armed forces of Russian Federation, engagement in armed conflict. It's written directly there that you should enlist in the Russian army, and the restriction of choice of education between Ukrainian education system and Russian education system. They say that Russian education does not exist, Ukrainian education does not exist, Ukrainian language does not exist. So this is the indicator of genocide. Unfortunately, this educational aspect is not inscribed in the international regulations, because when the convention was adopted on prevention of genocide crimes, the policies of culture and education were neglected as something excessive, something that does not pose lethal threat to lives of humans. Unfortunately, social policy is like that everywhere. Until you're killed, you can survive. That was the same thought prevailing about the genocide, but what we see is the cultural genocide. Ukrainians are being destroyed as identity through those acts of genocide. We can see it, what Russia is doing in the occupied territories. They destroy the representatives of Ukraine through destruction of the monuments, Ukrainian education, eradication of Ukrainian language, and further on we proceed to the tortures, the persecutions, police threats, intimidation. But unfortunately, there is no efficient method of countering it other than publicity and condemnation in all the levels, in international courts, international political organizations. Otherwise, we see no way of countering this. Mr. Oleg, please get engaged in our conversation as a psychologist. I will start with this statement. Please don't refer to Taliban, because they were never an ideology. They just are a political sect that started with Mullah Omar, and they have nothing to do with what we're talking about. Mr. Oleg, regarding our children that ended up in Russian Federation, who were deported, we see from those public cases that we were witnessing that they all try to counter, they try to resist the propaganda, they try to resist those education processes being imposed on them. Well, what situations are you talking about? We're saying that Maria Belova, she says that a child immediately was not communicating with her, and she was talking about the cases when he was resisting, maybe psychologically resisting. Well, among 1 million there were separate cases of resistance. I wanted to ask you, how long can a child resist, and how long does it take Russia to transform our children into Russian soldiers? Well, you're honestly talking in terms that have nothing to do with the science. It's the number of cliches. We all studied in school. We all remember how during school we were treating the study books that we were studying by all Ukrainian nationalists. They were studying in empire schools. All Russian dissidents were studying in Russian schools, so the level of formal study books, it's not so high as you wanted to see, to describe. the most influential are the environment and the parents. Those study books, they are a significant part of Russian propaganda, but it should be reinforced by something else. If child has some material evidences, I don't know, like some pluses, the candies, the sweets, they are supplementary to those. A child will accept those statements that they study in school. It's the human psychology, but without any supplementary factors, it's unrealistic. Also, there are some age groups, for example, children of the younger age and children of the older school age. They are different kinds of human. They react differently to the situations. Environment and parents, this is what's most influential in education. For example, the strategy of influence contemplates a number of factors. If such isolation within a couple of years, if it will continue, children will accept this ideology, because for them, in this environment, they will have no choice. They will have no reason to choose something else. Mr. Oleg, but we have children who are under occupation for 9 years, and some of them were just born in occupation. Well, they are lost children. Well, 9 years, after 2 or 3 years, people who end up in some information environment, they start demonstrating the indicators of this environment. For example, some children, they started perceiving this as reality that surrounds them, and the reality that comes from outside, it should be explained. Those children should be offered a priority why they should pick something else. We're talking about some cultural specificities. That's all something more inherent in adults, because if the parents share pro-Ukrainian values, their children will be pro-Ukrainian. If they are apolitical, this is how their children will grow up. There will be no arguments working for them. 9 years is 9 years. That's the lost generation. Well, it's very sad, but I apologize for my pathos, but you're not the first people I'm talking with about the young generation. But let's not circumvent ourselves that we can convince children who were growing up in different information environment, that we can influence them with some counter-propaganda that should be created together with other factors. If we offer some practical strategies, economic strategies, gender strategies, plus information strategies, this is how it would work. If we just wave the flags and we say that here we got history and this is what we are, that will not influence them. Again, it did not influence people in the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, Russian propaganda was quite massive. It did not influence people in Tsar Russia. That's the way the intellectuals circumvent themselves, either consciously or non-consciously. They try to believe in what they say themselves. The influence may only start from the moment we liberate the territory. Then we have a number of young people who were indoctrinated, and they should be talked to as the members of totalitarian sect. Russia is a totalitarian sect. Their strategy of information influence is a quasi-religious doctrine. This is the right term. The strategy of work with them is the segregation, the separation of their group. They're putting them into pro-Ukrainian environment where they talk to the equal ones, not with us. Of people, they should talk to people of equal age and work with juvenile police. For example, what they say in Russia: you are a child, you commit a crime, and you get away with it. They indoctrinate all those values through their ideology now in Russia. If we tell the parents that your children and you personally, you will be liable for spreading those ideas, this is how it would influence on them. But the cultural influence, well, it's beautiful, I share those values, but they're not efficient. Thank you. Anna, recently we've all seen your film about the return of our girls from deportation. I'm sure the film did not include all the information. You were communicating way more with them. You have more things to tell about. What do the deported children face, and what are the practical problems with their return? Well, in fact, we do the journalist investigations, and when we started liberating the Kharkiv, Kherson regions, we've seen the deportation of children. It had mass nature, and we started studying it as war crimes. We needed the mechanics, we needed the facts, what exactly is going on, who is involved, and what's going on with the kids. So this is how we were looking at this problem that we studied from the very beginning. In Kharkiv region, we've seen the children were reported as if to the recreation camps in Anapa, elsewhere, and they never returned. So when we're talking about the Russian system of education today, from the point of view of investigation, journalism, I can say that the system of education of Russian Federation, they assist to deportation of children. I mean, schools, universities, professional schools, they were offering those tours. They said it would be for 1, 2, 3 weeks, but the children never returned. They were initiators. Those educational institutions, they were the ones who forged the documents. They were contracting the buses for them. So the system of education is not something that we say like propaganda. They re-educate the children, but they are the point A, the square one from where the kidnapping of our children begins. This is very important. It's not like some people were walking around and handing leaflets with some propaganda. It was happening in educational institutions, and the parents, the children, they would definitely trust the school, they would trust the higher educational institution, the institute, university, and this is how the relations are built in a civilized world, that you give your child to them and they return it in 2 weeks after a tour. So the system of education are also very deeply involved in that crime. When children are told one thing, or their parents are told one thing, and children never return, this is the kidnapping. The parents, they accuse themselves sometimes, but they were promised something by the representatives of Russian government, the representatives of Russian educational institutions. Well, the story that we published, Escape from the Russians, it's not a demonstrative story, because those girls, they are teens, they are very patriotic, they demonstrated it, even having spent half a year in Kherson and then in Crimea and occupied Henichesk. They demonstrated their position in a number of ways. They were punished for them, they were castigated, there was a military police going to come see them, so they're very active in demonstrating their position. In fact, in Crimea and Henichesk, in the territory under Russian control, they spent there about 4 months. And if we shouldn't have helped them to escape, well, that they could feel worse, because there were other teens with them who were beaten, who were tortured, and as a journalist we were interested in documenting to the most extent possible what was going on with those kids. Those children, they were forced to write in Russian. They they say we don't know how to write in Russian language. We were listening to it. In fact, they were speaking in a mixed language, Russian, Ukrainian, but they were forced to listen to the Russian anthem every day, and they should have stood up every day. And when they didn't do so, they were asked why didn't they do so. This is the influence of Russian history, Russian books, those conversations about the important things, the patriotic education. This is what was happening to them from the very morning until the very evening. They were brainwashed on a daily basis. Mr. Pokalchuk was calling the numbers. I don't know how it happens. In that case, I don't think that the Russians managed to do something to those two girls. I don't know what could have been the consequences later on, but the fact that it happens on a systemic basis, we've seen it in those, we filmed it, we've seen it in their cases. It's not only the conversation that it's the Russian culture and this is the Ukrainian culture. Those were the conversation with children, the dialogue from the position of force. If you've seen that film, that conversation with the teacher from Henichesk, well, Henichesk is the occupied territory. It was occupied 1 year ago. She's definitely Ukrainian, and she talks to those girls as they are her property. Like, why have you left? Get me a video, I should show it to the police. I'm sure that even when Russians kidnapped the children, those teachers were not treating them so. So in that Russian education system, that teacher, they prevent those girls from coming back home. She says this is the dialogue of the education system with our kids, that those children are their property. So the work done by the human rights organizations, this is what we make up of the puzzle of genocide. From those small pieces, we are, as a journalist, we wanted to have a word in this. We document the war crimes and that part of the history that we're witnessing. Dear colleagues, you may get engaged in our conversation. Your questions, comments, please. Good afternoon, Marina Litvinenko, Ukrinform. I'm having a question to all the speakers. Probably there is a fact of this problem with the education system in the occupied territories. Ukrainian people, Ukrainian government, they say that we will liberate those territories. So what we as a civil society should do, the human rights organizations, media, the lawyers, what should we do to promote the topic of education in temporarily occupied territories, to uncover this problem even inside Ukraine? Well, it's not as maybe popular as the problem of deportation. In international platforms, this problem was mentioned, and it's again considered to be something easy. Maybe Ukraine may become a locomotive of some legal changes in this regard. Well, if I may start, I will start with the international humanitarian law. Really, if we talk about the international law in general, it's very politicized, and to sweeten all the countries to comply with all the rules stipulated there, it was intentionally made easy to understand, like the government should not kill, everybody should comply, everybody should be in accord with peace, and practically it's impossible to show any regulation in the international law. I'm not even talking about international humanitarian law, where it should have been written that propaganda of war, propaganda of eradication of other peoples, propaganda of something lethal for other peoples is something that should be prohibited in education. Unfortunately, there are no such regulations, and condemning Russia is not something possible, because the reaction of international community to those events is just like a reaction of a newborn child. It's incomprehensible. This policy is incomprehensible. Nobody understands how children go through those processes, go out of those processes, and what to do. Upon the occupation, Ukrainian state has a lot of questions about that, because there is no strategy developed. Nobody has an imagination of what to do with the occupied territories. That there are some territories that we have deoccupied within short periods, like Kiev region, Kharkiv region, Kherson. But even there is a question what to do with the people who were under occupation for a prolonged period of time. And when we start talking about Crimea and DPR, LPR, people were living there for 9 years, and state of Ukraine, in coordination with international experts, international specialists, foreign governments, only last year in Lugano, we proclaimed some vision of how the process of reconciliation and recovery will be happening. They are all focused in some economic achievements, infrastructure development, but as to the policy of recovery of the people, return of those people to reality, because I agree with Mr. Pokalchuk that those people are lost generation, they're zombies, but to get them back to reality in order not to create the new crisis in the region, not to create the new threat with some incredible things like resistance and insurgencies, we have to start developing those strategies, those visions, those mechanisms. We may use the experience of other conflicts like Yugoslavia, Rwanda, in Asian countries. There were certain institutions created, the schools for re-education of culture, the study of culture of the people who experienced genocide, the peoples who were persecuted. There were dialogues for reconciliation between those peoples. We can take into account those mechanisms. We can try to use them for Ukrainian situation, but they will not be 100% efficient. Not all of the people will join those mechanisms. Not everybody will agree. We will feel resistance. There should be a number of plans, not only those mechanisms for reconciliation, the schools for Ukrainization of content in mass media, some cultural measures, cultural events. We have to create this information field. We also have to create it for the territories which were under control of Ukrainian government, because the people who come back from the occupied territories, including children, specifically children, they will need to live with us. And us, in our majority, we will not be perceiving them quite well. We will perceive them as the potential collaborationists, traitors, brainwashed people, zombies, the adherents of Russian Federation. This is what's going to happen. They indeed will be the lost generation, not only those who come from the occupied territories, but even those who were born under control of Ukraine. It will be a number of years before the state of Ukraine will eventually become a winner in this situation, in this 100-long conflict. Well, for me, this conflict is going on for centuries, since the moment Moscow was founded. It will be a great tragedy. It will be the crisis of generations, but we should start doing it already now. Civil society, the scientists, the experts. I'm passing the microphone to Ms. Marina. I will be brief. First of all, I would like the society to see those because those children are now not seen by the Ukrainian society. Secondly, I would like the Ministry of Education finally to have the Directorate of Education in the occupied territories. And if this directorate would have emerged, and it's clear it should exist, because we're talking about more than 1 million children that are under occupation for the moment. So upon creation of some expert teams, expert groups in that directorate, we would be able to see what we do with preschool education, higher education, school education, secondary education. Those would have been the steps taken by the government, the real steps. Now those steps, for me, is something I cannot understand. Those steps are being taken by the Ministry of Reintegration. That ministry, they have a lot of other work to do, but education is something that should be dealt with by the Ministry of Education. And unfortunately, during one of the public posts of Mr. Lisavy, the new Minister of Education, he mentioned the children who currently get education in the European countries. He said they are our children and we will take care of them, but he never mentioned the 1 million of children who are forced to learn in the occupied territories. We cannot get them deprived of the education, but we have to be very loud about what Daryna was mentioned. It's violation of the international law. Those children, they have the right in convention, in compliance with the Convention on the Cultural Identity of the country of origin for those children. But they have no access to Ukrainian language. They have no access to the history of Ukraine. When we talk about the study books, we have another research as to the history of Ukraine and the study books on history of Russia. It was quite surprising for us that Ukraine is not in the world history study book. If it's a different country, it should be showing up among other countries along with Britain, United States, Germany. But Ukraine is not there, and we started searching, and Ukraine exists in the study books of Russian history, but it's not described as another state. And when you are a child which was born in Crimea and you understand that there is no such country as Ukraine, you're 9 years old, and you understand that Russia is in war for its territories. They fight for their territories because this is how it's written in the study book. And I understand that in that case we should be talking about totalitarian sect, and we should be working with them as with the people who were a part of those totalitarian sects, but it should be done on the level of a separate directorate for education in the occupied territories, and that directorate should have created back in 2014. We shouldn't have started talking about it only in 2023. I apologize for emotions. Well, just in brief, what can we do about it now? Us as a journalist, we have to demonstrate the consequences of this education. Fortunately or unfortunately, the consequences can be seen after years, but now we have Crimea. We were studying it in our investigations. We were studying Russian military who came from Crimea, who were fighting on the side of Russia. They were 18 or 20, and they were 10 years old when Russia captured Crimea. They were educated in Russian reality. They went on a war with their compatriots when they were in the elementary school. It seems like for us as a journalists, those who can do such investigations, we should be demonstrating the consequences. If we continue demonstrating those consequences, we may see whom Russia grows. We cannot do it within 2 or 3 years, but we had a story about a Russian military from Crimea who was growing up in Kherson region. So he came back to capture Crimea. He was trying to evacuate, he was trying to organize the operation for evacuating his mother from Crimea, from Kherson region. So he asked the Russian soldiers to kidnap her at 5 o'clock. He came to Kherson region to kill the others, but he wanted to evacuate his mother. Obviously, it was some contradiction in his head. He wanted to save his mother, but he wanted to kill other people on that land. This is how it deforms the people's view of the world. This is the only thing that we can do as a journalist. That easy humanitarian policy, it should be closer to reality. Well, thank you very much for this conversation. Joining us were Valentina Potapova, Daryna Pidgorna, Oleg Pokalchuk, Babinets. Thank you very much for interest in this topic. We're facing a lot of challenges. The process of reintegration will not be easy for sure. Our next briefing will be in just couple of minutes. We will be talking about the mobile application for search of the lost children. So bear with us. Trust in the armed forces, and glory to Ukraine.